Tonight's story drifts quietly into the world of anime and memory. A tale shaped by loss, determination, and the quiet strength of human bonds. Settle in, relax your thoughts, and let the story unfold slowly as we begin this peaceful retelling. In the quiet countryside of Amestris, far from the stone towers of Central City, there was a small town named Resembool. It was a place where the days passed gently, measured by the rhythm of wind through tall grass and the steady ticking of clocks being repaired in modest homes. In one such home lived two brothers, Edward and Alphonse Elric. Edward was the older of the two, small for his age, sharp-eyed, always restless. Alphonse followed closely behind him, taller even as a child, kind-hearted and soft-spoken. Together, they spent their days surrounded by books, gears, and chalk-drawn symbols etched carefully into the wooden floor. Alchemy was not forbidden here. It was a craft, a science, a language for understanding how the world fit together. Their mother, Trisha, watched them with quiet warmth. She never scolded them for their curiosity. Instead, she smiled as Edward excitedly explained formulas far too advanced for his years, and as Alphonse listened with wide-eyed admiration. The house was filled with warmth then, meals shared at the table, laughter echoing softly through the halls, and the feeling that nothing could truly go wrong. But time, patient and unmoving, continued forward. Trisha's illness arrived quietly. At first it was only fatigue, then long rests, then days when she could no longer rise from bed. Edward and Alphonse tried everything they knew. They researched late into the night, pages turning softly beneath candlelight, hoping knowledge alone could save her. It could not. When Trisha passed away, the house fell silent. The ticking clocks felt louder, the wind outside colder. The boys sat together in the stillness, unsure how to fill the space she had left behind. For Edward, the silence became unbearable. For Alphonse, it became something to endure quietly. And in that silence, a dangerous idea took root. If alchemy could change the world, then perhaps it could undo death. The books warned against it. Human transmutation was forbidden for a reason. But grief has a way of blurring rules, and hope can be far louder than caution. Night after night, the brothers prepared. Chalk circles grew more precise. Ingredients were gathered with trembling hands. Every detail was checked and rechecked, driven by the belief that love alone might be enough. On the night of the ritual, rain fell softly against the window. The circle glowed. And then, everything went wrong. What emerged was not their mother. What followed was pain, loss, and a truth far heavier than either boy could understand. When the light faded, Edward lay broken. Alphonse was gone. In desperation, Edward made a final sacrifice, binding his brother's soul to a suit of armor, cold and hollow, yet still holding the voice he loved. The rain continued to fall as dawn approached. Nothing could be undone. In that quiet aftermath, a lesson was learned, not spoken, but carved into memory. Some things cannot be reclaimed. And so, from that small house in Resembool, a long journey quietly began, born from love, loss, and the unyielding bond between two brothers. Morning arrived slowly in Resembool, pale light stretching across the hills as though the world itself was unsure how to continue. Inside the small house, the air felt different, thinner, heavier, weighted with what could not be undone. Edward awoke first. Pain greeted him before thought. It spread through his body in deep, unrelenting waves, anchoring him to the floor where the ritual circle still faintly marked the wood. His breath came unevenly as he tried to move, and only then did he understand what had been taken from him. Where his arm should have been, there was nothing. His leg, too, was gone, the cost demanded by the gate he had opened. He called out instinctively, his voice breaking the silence. Alphonse did not answer. Panic rose sharply, cutting through the fog of pain. Edward dragged himself forward, leaving faint marks behind him, his eyes scanning the room in disbelief. The ritual circle lay shattered, symbols distorted and broken. There was no sign of his brother, no footsteps, no warmth, only absence. Then he heard it, a quiet, hollow sound, metal shifting gently. Edward turned. Standing nearby was a suit of armor, tall and unfamiliar, its surface still and lifeless. And yet, from within it came a voice, soft, uncertain, unmistakably Alphonse. Edward stared, his mind struggling to accept what his eyes could not explain. His brother was there, speaking, aware, but no longer flesh and bone. In a moment of desperate instinct, Edward realized what he had done. In the final seconds of the ritual, he had bound Alphonse's soul to steel, anchoring him to the physical world by force of will alone. The house felt unbearably quiet again. Help arrived not long after. Their childhood friend Winry rushed in with her grandmother, Pinako, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as they took in the scene. There were no words strong enough for what had happened. Only action remained. Edward's recovery was slow and painful. Metal replaced what had been lost, forged carefully, lovingly, by hands that trembled but never failed. The automail was heavy at first, cold and unyielding, a constant reminder of the night everything changed. Each movement required effort. Each step demanded patience. Alphonse stayed close, watching silently, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to feel the warmth of touch. Yet he never complained. His concern remained fixed on his brother, as though his own loss mattered less. When Edward finally stood again, the sound of metal meeting earth echoed through the room. That sound marked the end of childhood. In the weeks that followed, the brothers made a decision without ceremony. They would not remain in Resembool, surrounded by memories that refused to fade. Instead, they would move forward. They would learn more. They would understand the truth of alchemy, no matter how painful it became. Somewhere beyond the quiet hills, answers waited. And so, with steel footsteps and quiet resolve, the brothers turned their backs on the past, not to forget it, but to honor it. Their journey had truly begun. The road beyond Resembool stretched long and quiet, winding through open fields and distant towns where the world carried on, unaware of the burden the brothers carried with them. Edward walked slightly ahead, his steps uneven as he adjusted to the weight of automail. Each movement required focus. Each sound of metal against earth reminded him of the price he had paid. Still, he pressed forward, jaw set with determination. Alphonse followed closely, the soft clink of armor marking his presence. Though his body no longer breathed or tired, he moved carefully, mindful of Edward's pace. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing the world through sight and sound alone. The rustle of leaves, the murmur of passing travelers, the quiet rhythm of life continuing as it always had. Their destination was knowledge. They traveled from town to town, trading small acts of alchemy for food, lodging, and access to books. Libraries became temporary homes. Candlelight illuminated page after page as Edward studied late into the night, searching for references to the Philosopher's Stone. Ancient texts spoke of it in fragments and half-truths, an object said to bypass the laws of equivalent exchange, to grant power without sacrifice. Hope returned quietly. If such a thing existed, then restoration might be possible. Along the way, they encountered other alchemists, some proud, some weary, all bound by the same rules. Edward's talent became impossible to ignore. His ability to transmute without a circle drew attention, admiration, and suspicion in equal measure. Whispers followed him from town to town, the name Fullmetal spoken softly by those who noticed the gleam of his limbs. Eventually, word of the brothers reached the military. An invitation arrived, formal, distant, unavoidable. The State Alchemist program offered access to restricted knowledge, research facilities, and national records. In exchange, it demanded loyalty, service, and obedience. Edward hesitated only briefly. If answers were hidden behind closed doors, then he would find a way through them. The examination was swift and merciless. Edward demonstrated his skill with calm precision, transforming stone and steel as easily as breath. Observers watched in silence, measuring not only his power, but his resolve. When it ended, Edward Elric was granted the title of State Alchemist, the youngest in history. The pocket watch he received felt heavier than it looked. Its ticking echoed softly, marking time not just forward, but away, from childhood, from innocence, from the boy he had once been. That night, as the brothers stood beneath a quiet sky, Edward closed his hand around the watch. They were no longer just searching. They were bound to the path ahead, one that would lead them closer to the truth, no matter how dark it became. And in the stillness of the open road, the brothers continued onward, carrying hope carefully, as though it might shatter if held too tightly. The desert town of Lior rose quietly from the sand, its stone buildings worn smooth by wind and time. Bells echoed faintly in the distance, their sound carried gently through narrow streets filled with murmured prayers and hopeful faces. Edward and Alphonse arrived without ceremony, blending easily into the slow-moving crowds. The people spoke often of miracles here, of a man who could heal the sick, bring rain to dry land, and promise reunion with the dead. His name was Cornello, and to the faithful, he was a living answer to grief. Edward listened carefully as they walked. He noticed the way belief softened sorrow, how hope took shape in shared rituals and quiet devotion. But beneath the surface, something felt wrong. The alchemy at work was too precise, too deliberate. Inside the temple, the air was cool and still. Cornello stood before his followers, his presence calm and commanding. He spoke gently, offering comfort where pain had taken root. And when he performed his miracles, the crowd watched in awe. Edward stepped forward. What followed was not a battle, but a revelation. Edward spoke calmly, dismantling illusion with careful logic. He explained the rules of alchemy, the impossibility of creating something from nothing. As the truth unfolded, the glow of false hope faded, replaced by quiet realization. Cornello's power came from an imitation philosopher's stone. When it shattered, the deception collapsed with it. The crowd dispersed slowly, confusion and disappointment settling like dust. Some wept. Others stood silently, unsure where to place their faith now that it had been taken away. Among them stood a young girl named Rose. She remained still long after the others left, her grief returning in waves she could no longer push aside. Edward watched her carefully, recognizing something familiar in her expression. Later, as the sun dipped low and the desert cooled, the brothers prepared to leave. Rose thanked them quietly, though her voice carried uncertainty rather than relief. Edward did not offer comfort he could not guarantee. Instead, he spoke softly of moving forward, of finding meaning not in miracles, but in living. As they walked away from Lior, the sand stretching endlessly before them, Edward felt the weight of what they had done. Truth could free people, but it could also leave them exposed. Alphonse followed in silence, the setting sun reflecting off his armor like fading embers. The Philosopher's Stone was real enough to deceive, and wherever it existed, it carried consequences far greater than either of them yet understood. The journey carried the brothers away from the desert and back toward the heart of the country, where wide roads led to tall stone buildings and orderly streets. Central City rose before them with quiet authority, its towers standing firm against the open sky. Here, everything moved with purpose. Soldiers marched in steady lines. Clerks hurried between offices. Trains arrived and departed with mechanical precision. The air felt controlled, shaped by rules and structure rather than belief or hope. Edward felt it immediately, the difference between faith-driven towns and a nation governed by order. They were not alone for long. Roy Mustang greeted them with an easy calm, his expression relaxed, his tone light, as though the weight of command rested comfortably on his shoulders. Beside him stood Riza Hawkeye, quiet and observant, her presence steady and reassuring. She said little, but her gaze missed nothing. The brothers were given access to libraries few ever entered. Shelves stretched high with records of research, military history, and alchemical study. Edward moved through them with focused intensity, searching for references others might overlook. Alphonse followed, listening, watching, absorbing the unspoken tension that lingered beneath the polished floors. It became clear that knowledge here was not freely given. It was managed. Between meetings and reports, Edward noticed how often Mustang deflected certain questions, guiding conversations away from sensitive topics. There were things even state alchemists were not meant to know. And yet, within brief moments of honesty, Mustang revealed something else. A quiet desire for change, a sense that the system they served was not as righteous as it appeared. At night, the brothers rested in temporary quarters. Edward lay awake, listening to the ticking of his pocket watch echo softly in the dark. Each second felt deliberate, reminding him that time itself was moving them closer to answers they might not be ready to face. Alphonse stood nearby, still and silent, gazing out at the city lights. Central felt vast to him, distant in a way Resembool never had. He wondered how many people lived here without ever questioning the foundations beneath their feet. As dawn approached, Edward rose quietly. If the Philosopher's Stone existed, then the truth was hidden somewhere within this ordered world. And if the military stood between them and that truth, then they would learn how to move carefully, step by measured step. Central City watched silently as the brothers continued forward, unaware that its deepest secrets had already begun to stir. Beyond the organized streets of Central, there existed places that no longer appeared on maps. Old research facilities stood abandoned at the edges of the city, their walls cracked, their entrances sealed as though time itself had been instructed to forget them. It was toward one of these forgotten places that the brothers were quietly guided, following fragmented records and hushed warnings left behind by those who no longer spoke. The laboratory was silent when they arrived. Its corridors stretched long and narrow, lit only by the faint glow of alchemical residue that clung to the walls like a memory refusing to fade. Edward moved carefully, his footsteps echoing softly. Alphonse followed, the sound of armor subdued, almost respectful, as though even the steel understood where it stood. Inside, they found remnants of experiments long abandoned, broken tables, shattered glass, notes half burned and scattered across the floor. Nothing here felt accidental. The destruction had been deliberate, thorough, meant to erase more than evidence. As Edward studied the fragments, a realization settled slowly into place. The Philosopher's Stone had been researched here, not as myth, not as legend, but as a project. The notes spoke of human lives measured and reduced to numbers, of souls refined, condensed, and used as fuel. There was no grand language in the records, only cold efficiency. Alchemy stripped of wonder, reduced to function. Alphonse stood still as Edward read aloud. Neither brother raised his voice. They did not need to. The truth was heavy enough on its own. If the Philosopher's Stone could restore what they had lost, it would demand a cost far greater than they had imagined. It was not a shortcut around sacrifice. It was sacrifice itself, reshaped into something usable. When soldiers arrived, the confrontation was brief and contained. Words were exchanged carefully, weapons lowered but not forgotten. The brothers left the laboratory behind, carrying knowledge that could not be returned to silence. Outside, the air felt cooler. The sky above Central stretched wide and unchanged, indifferent to what had been uncovered beneath it. Edward clenched his fist quietly, automail fingers tightening with resolve rather than anger. They would not turn back. But from that moment forward, the search for the Philosopher's Stone was no longer guided by hope alone. It was guided by truth. And truth, once known, could never be forgotten. The rain fell gently as the brothers arrived at a modest home on a quiet street. Warm light glowed from the windows, and for a moment the place felt inviting, safe in a way that reminded them of Resembool. They were welcomed inside by Sho Tucker, a state alchemist whose manner was polite and subdued. His voice never rose above a careful calm, and his smile seemed practiced, as though he had learned how to wear it long ago. His young daughter, Nina, greeted the brothers with simple joy, her laughter filling the room with a softness that eased the weight they carried. Meals were shared. Conversations drifted lightly between studies and small comforts. For a short while, the world felt ordinary again. Edward noticed the books first. Volumes stacked neatly, their margins filled with notes written in tight, anxious script. Alphonse noticed the silence between Tucker's words, the pauses that lingered just a moment too long. Something here felt fragile, held together by effort rather than peace. Days passed quietly. Then, the house changed. Nina's laughter faded. The rooms felt emptier, though nothing had been moved. Edward searched the house with growing unease, his steps quickening as understanding began to form. When the truth revealed itself, it did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It simply stood there, the result of an experiment that should never have been attempted. Edward's voice trembled, not with anger, but with disbelief as he spoke. Words felt inadequate, falling apart before they could offer meaning. Alphonse stood frozen, unable to look away, the hollow echo of his armor amplifying the stillness in the room. There was no justification that could soften what had been done. When the military arrived, the matter was handled swiftly. Procedures were followed, statements were taken. The house fell silent once more, its warmth extinguished completely. The brothers left without looking back. Outside, the rain continued, washing the streets clean but offering no relief. Edward walked ahead, his shoulders tense, his breath unsteady. Alphonse followed, saying nothing, carrying the weight of a truth neither of them could set down. Some knowledge could be pursued, some truths could be endured, but others remained, quiet reminders that even with rules and restraint, Humanity was capable of reaching too far and losing itself in the process. That night, the brothers did not study. They listened instead to the rain, letting the sound fill the space where words no longer could. The days that followed moved slowly, as though the world itself needed time to breathe after what had been revealed. Edward and Alphonse traveled onward without urgency, their steps measured, their conversations sparse. Yet even in quiet places, something followed them. Whispers began to surface. Stories of strange beings that did not age, that healed too quickly, that moved through conflict untouched by time. At first, they sounded like rumors shaped by fear. But the brothers had learned not to dismiss unease so easily. It was in a dimly lit street, far from the comfort of open roads, that they encountered one of them. She introduced herself calmly, her voice smooth and unhurried. Her name was Lust. Her presence felt deliberate, as though she had always been meant to stand there, waiting. There was no immediate threat in her posture, no raised voice or sudden movement. And yet, every instinct Edward had told him something was deeply wrong. Others appeared soon after. Envy watched from a distance, smiling without warmth. Gluttony lingered nearby, quiet and patient, as though hunger itself guided him. Together, they spoke of things far older than the brothers, of plans unfolding slowly, of a figure they called Father. The name lingered in the air. There was no clear explanation offered, no full revelation, only fragments, hints. A sense that the brothers' search for the Philosopher's Stone was not their own alone, that unseen hands had been guiding events long before Edward and Alphonse ever drew a transmutation circle. When the encounter ended, it did so without closure. The figures vanished into shadow as easily as they had appeared, leaving behind questions rather than answers. The night felt colder afterward. Edward walked ahead, his thoughts restless. Alphonse followed, the quiet weight of his armor echoing softly against stone. They both understood, without speaking, that their journey had entered a new phase. The Philosopher's Stone was no longer just an object to be found. It was part of something alive, something watching. And somewhere beneath the surface of the country they walked upon, a presence waited patiently, allowing time to pass, certain that everything would eventually fall into place. The land changed as the brothers traveled north. Grass gave way to stone, and stone to ice. The air thinned, sharpened, carrying with it a cold that pressed inward rather than simply surrounding them. Breath became visible. Sound carried farther. Even silence felt more absolute. At the edge of this frozen world stood Fort Briggs. It rose from the mountains like a wall against the sky, carved from iron and resolve rather than stone alone. Soldiers moved with purpose here, their steps firm, their voices brief. Nothing about Briggs was ornamental. Everything existed to endure. Edward felt it immediately. This place did not allow weakness. They were brought before General Olivier Mira Armstrong, whose gaze was steady and unyielding. She listened without interruption as Edward spoke, weighing each word carefully. There was no warmth in her expression, but neither was there cruelty, only clarity. At Briggs, survival came before comfort. Truth came before loyalty. Edward worked alongside engineers and soldiers alike, repairing, reinforcing, learning. He spoke little, observing how discipline here was not enforced through fear, but through trust earned by action. Alphonse watched from the sidelines, taking in the rhythm of a place where every person understood their role completely. In the stillness of the mountain nights, Edward studied the flow of alchemy beneath the ice. He sensed something unnatural. Lines of power that felt forced, shaped rather than formed. The land itself seemed strained, as though it had been bent into place by design. Briggs was not ignorant of danger. It was preparing for it. As snow fell endlessly beyond the walls, Edward understood that whatever Father was planning, this fortress stood directly in its path. And here, far from the polished halls of Central, people were ready to resist quietly, patiently, without waiting to be told. The brothers left Briggs with more than information. They left with allies. And as they descended from the frozen mountains, the cold lingered, not on their skin, but in the knowledge that the world was moving steadily toward a moment no one could stop. The road turned eastward, away from snow and stone, toward warmer winds and unfamiliar accents. Markets grew louder, colors brighter, and the scent of spices drifted through crowded streets. It was here that the brothers encountered a traveler whose calm smile hid a quiet urgency. His name was Ling. He spoke lightly, laughed easily, and moved with the confidence of someone used to danger. Yet beneath his relaxed manner lay purpose. Ling came from a distant land across the desert and sea, a place where power shifted like sand and survival depended on foresight. He too searched for the Philosopher's Stone, not for himself, but for his people. The brothers listened as Ling explained his journey. His words carried respect for life, even as he spoke of immortality. He did not seek the stone out of greed, but out of responsibility. The weight of leadership pressed on him quietly, shaping every choice he made. Traveling together felt natural. They shared meals beneath open skies, exchanging stories in the low glow of lantern light. Edward spoke of loss without embellishment. Alphonse listened, offering understanding without judgment. Ling, in turn, spoke of a land bound by tradition and ambition, where rulers were measured not by strength alone, but by the lives they protected. Yet danger followed closely. One night, shadows moved too smoothly for comfort. A presence slipped between buildings with unsettling ease, and before words could be exchanged, the air shifted. Envy appeared without warning, their voice carrying amusement rather than threat. What followed was brief but revealing, a reminder that the forces watching them were never far away. When the encounter ended, silence returned slowly. Ling's smile faded just enough to reveal concern. He understood now that the Philosopher's Stone was entangled in something far larger than legend. And still, he chose to continue. At dawn, the three stood together at the edge of the road. Their goals differed, but their paths aligned. Without ceremony, they agreed to move forward as one, aware that trust was something built over time, not declared. As they traveled on, the sun rising gently behind them, the journey expanded, not just across land, but across borders, ideals, and quiet promises made beneath an open sky. As the journey continued, patterns began to emerge. At first, they were easy to dismiss, coincidences shaped by distance and time, cities positioned too evenly, conflicts erupting in places that, when viewed alone, seemed unrelated. But when Edward began to trace them carefully, a shape slowly revealed itself. A design. Maps spread across tables in borrowed rooms. Lines were drawn lightly, then redrawn with growing certainty. Each war, each uprising, Each tragedy marked a point. When connected, they formed something unmistakable. A transmutation circle. Not drawn with chalk or ink, but with cities, borders, and lives. Edward stared at it in silence, the realization settling deeply. Amestris itself was not merely a nation, it was a construct. Its history had been guided, its suffering shaped with purpose. The Philosopher's Stone was not the end goal. It was a tool. Alphonse listened as Edward spoke, his voice low and controlled. Though he could not feel the weight of the room, he sensed the gravity of the truth pressing inward. The ground beneath them no longer felt neutral. It felt chosen. Ling watched quietly, his expression thoughtful. He understood then why forces beyond the country's borders had been drawn here. Why so many paths converged on this land without explanation. Somewhere beneath Central, something waited. The realization did not bring panic. It brought clarity. If the nation itself was part of a ritual, then stopping what was coming would require more than strength. It would require understanding, coordination, trust between people who had never intended to stand on the same side. That night, as lantern light flickered softly against the walls, the brothers sat together in silence. The world outside continued on, unaware, unchanged, peaceful in its ignorance. But the shape of the truth had been seen, and once seen, it could not be ignored. The country slept. Beneath it, something stirred. The past began to surface, not all at once, but in fragments carried by memory and scar. Stories of Ishval reached the brothers through quiet conversations and reluctant confessions. It had been a land of faith and tradition, where alchemy was forbidden and belief shaped daily life. When conflict came, it did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly, guided by orders issued far from the dust and blood. The Ishvalan War was spoken of carefully. Roy Mustang remembered fire that answered his command too easily, spreading farther than intention could restrain. Riza Hawkeye carried knowledge etched into her very being, truths passed down not to empower, but to burden. They did not speak of heroism. They spoke of responsibility and of regret. Scar walked the land as a living reminder of what remained unresolved. Once, he had been a man with a name, a brother, and a place among his people. Now he moved with quiet purpose, his red eyes reflecting loss rather than rage. His path was one of vengeance, but it was shaped by grief, not cruelty. Each step he took carried the weight of a past that refused to rest. Alphonse watched Scar carefully when their paths crossed. He sensed a familiarity in him, a soul shaped by loss, bound to something he could not let go. Edward, too, recognized it. The line between justice and destruction felt thin, easily crossed when pain was left unhealed. The war had ended, but it had never truly concluded. It lived on in memories, in guilt, in unfinished truths buried beneath official reports. And as the brothers listened, learned, and observed, they understood that what was coming had roots deep in that blood-soaked history. The past was not gone. As days passed, Alphonse found himself growing quieter. At first it was subtle, a pause before answering, a moment of stillness that lingered longer than usual. Edward noticed it not through words, but through absence. Alphonse no longer asked certain questions. He listened, but his thoughts seemed to drift somewhere distant. One night, beneath a sky softened by thin clouds, Alphonse spoke at last. His voice echoed gently from within the armor, uncertain but steady. He spoke of memories that no longer felt solid, moments from childhood that blurred at the edges, as though they belonged to someone else. He wondered aloud if his soul truly belonged where it was bound, or if it had been shaped by Edward's desperation rather than truth. Edward stopped walking. The road stretched ahead, quiet and unchanged, but for a moment, everything felt unbalanced. Edward turned slowly, listening as Alphonse continued. He spoke not with fear, but with quiet honesty. What if he was only an imitation? What if the warmth he remembered had never truly been his? Edward answered without raising his voice. He reminded Alphonse of shared laughter, of scraped knees and whispered plans, of moments no false memory could fabricate. He spoke of bonds formed not by bodies, but by choices made again and again. His words were careful, deliberate, anchored in certainty rather than emotion. Alphonse listened. The doubt did not vanish completely, but it softened, settling into something manageable. The question remained, but it no longer controlled him. He stood taller, the metal frame steadying as resolve returned. Some things, Edward realized, could not be proven through alchemy or logic. Some truths existed simply because they endured. The brothers continued forward side by side, carrying not just the weight of their past, but the quiet strength of trust that had never truly left them. Beneath Central City, far below stone streets and orderly halls, there existed a place untouched by sunlight. There, surrounded by silence and shadow, Father waited. He appeared calm, almost gentle, seated within a chamber carved deep into the earth, his presence unhurried, his gaze distant. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice carried neither anger nor urgency. Time meant little to him. He had already waited centuries. The homunculi moved according to his design, each born from a fragment he had cast aside long ago. Lust carried desire without restraint. Envy bore jealousy shaped into cruelty. Pride watched with patient contempt. They were pieces of him, given form so he could remain unburdened by weakness. Above ground, Edward and Alphonse began to understand the shape of the threat they faced. Father did not hate humanity. He simply did not value it. People, to him, were energy, necessary, plentiful, replaceable. Their lives formed the final components of a ritual drawn patiently across generations. The promised day approached not as a moment of chaos, but as a calculated conclusion. The realization did not arrive with fear. It arrived with certainty. Edward felt it settle in his chest, steady and resolute. If this was the truth of the world, then it was something that could be confronted. Not through power alone, but through refusal to accept it. Alphonse stood quietly beside him, his presence unwavering, his resolve unspoken but absolute. The pieces were in motion now. Across the country, unseen lines tightened. Old alliances stirred. Quiet preparations continued beneath ordinary days. The world above slept, unaware of how close it was to being reshaped. And below it all, Father waited, confident that when the moment arrived, nothing would stand in his way. Preparation did not arrive with banners or declarations. It unfolded quietly. Across Amestris, small movements began to align. Conversations held behind closed doors. Messages passed discreetly from one trusted hand to another. Those who had seen enough of the truth recognized one another without needing to speak it aloud. Roy Mustang gathered allies carefully. His tone remained light in public, but beneath it was focus sharpened by years of restraint. Riza Hawkeye stood at his side, steady and precise, guarding knowledge that had already cost too much to misuse. Together, they prepared not for glory, but for responsibility. At Fort Briggs, Olivier Mira Armstrong moved with deliberate confidence. Supplies were secured. Soldiers trained without explanation, trusting that when the time came, they would understand. No speeches were given. Strength here did not require reassurance. Scar walked his own path. His vengeance had softened into something quieter, an understanding shaped by memory rather than anger. The destruction he once pursued blindly now became a means of disruption, aimed not at people, but at the structure that had turned them into tools. Edward and Alphonse moved between these currents, carrying knowledge rather than commands. They spoke when needed. They listened more often. Trust grew not from promises, but from shared recognition of what must be done. As the promised day drew nearer, the world above remained calm. Children played in the streets. Markets opened at dawn. Trains arrived on time. And beneath it all, the final pieces settled into place, each person standing where they had chosen to stand, not because they were told to, but because they understood. The quiet before the moment stretched long, and in that stillness, resolve held. The promised day arrived without announcement. Morning light touched the rooftops of Central City just as it always had, soft and unremarkable. Streets filled with routine movement. Offices opened. Trains ran on schedule. To most, it was simply another day. Below the city, the ground trembled. Hidden passages awakened as though responding to a signal long prepared. Stone shifted. Doors sealed. The transmutation circle, etched across the nation through years of quiet design, stood complete. And then, the silence broke. All at once, movement surged through the depths beneath Central. Homunculi emerged from shadowed corridors, their calm expressions unchanged, their purpose unwavering. Above ground, allies moved into place with practiced precision, each action measured, each step deliberate. Edward and Alphonse descended into the underground maze, the air growing heavier with each level. The walls seemed to hum faintly, resonating with power drawn from every corner of the country. Edward felt it pressing against him, not as force, but as inevitability. Battles unfolded without spectacle. Steel met stone. Flame met darkness. Old enemies stood side by side, driven not by revenge, but by necessity. In narrow corridors and vast chambers alike, resolve outweighed fear. Roy Mustang faced the depths with controlled fury, his fire illuminating truth long hidden. At Briggs, soldiers advanced with disciplined calm, holding the line against creatures that refused to fall easily. Scar moved through the chaos with focused intent, disrupting the circle piece by piece, undoing what had been built through suffering. At the center of it all, Edward confronted the scale of what Father intended. The ritual began to activate. Energy surged upward, ancient and vast, drawn from every life bound unknowingly to the design. For a brief moment, it felt as though the world itself held its breath. And then, resistance answered. The circle faltered. What had been planned as an ending became something uncertain, unstable, no longer absolute. Father rose from stillness, his calm expression cracking for the first time, as interference disrupted the perfection he had waited so long to achieve. The moment stretched. The outcome was no longer guaranteed. And in that fragile pause between intention and consequence, the fate of the country balanced quietly, awaiting the choices still to come. In the heart of the underground chamber, time seemed to slow. Edward stepped forward as Father's presence filled the space, vast and composed, his form shifting as though the world itself bent willingly around him. There was no anger in Father's gaze, only mild curiosity, as if observing a variable that had behaved unexpectedly. With a single motion, Father reached outward. The connection Edward had relied on all his life vanished. The flow of alchemy fell silent within him, leaving behind an unfamiliar stillness. The gate he had passed through so many times felt distant, unreachable. Edward stood there, suddenly ordinary, his automail heavy, his breath steady but unassisted by power. For a brief moment, the absence felt startling. Then it felt clarifying. Edward steadied himself, planting his feet against the stone floor. He did not retreat. He did not hesitate. Without alchemy, he moved forward anyway, fists raised, resolve unbroken. Every strike was imperfect, human, fueled not by transmutation, but by refusal. Around him, the struggle continued. Allies pressed on despite injury and exhaustion. Scar's work disrupted the final lines of the circle. Mustang's flames burned not wildly, but with purpose. Each action chipped away at inevitability, replacing it with choice. Father reacted with irritation rather than fear. He did not understand resistance that came without power. Edward understood something else instead. That strength did not come from shortcuts or borrowed energy. It came from enduring loss and continuing regardless. From standing even when stripped of advantage. As the chamber shook and the air thickened, Edward remained on his feet, moving forward one step at a time. The battle had shifted, not toward domination, but toward resolve. The chamber trembled as the struggle deepened, stone dust drifting slowly through the air like falling ash. Voices echoed, then faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of effort and breath. In the midst of it all, Alphonse stood still for a moment, listening. He felt the pull before he understood it. The connection that bound his soul to armor vibrated faintly, as though responding to a call only he could hear. Edward fought on ahead, unaware, pushing forward with everything he had left. Alphonse watched him, memories rising gently. Shared laughter in Resembool. Long nights studying by candlelight. Promises made without words. The decision came quietly. There was no panic in it, no hesitation. Alphonse stepped back, placing a hand against the cold metal that had been his body for so long. He spoke softly, his voice calm, steady, filled with certainty. The choice was not about sacrifice as loss. It was about trust. He offered himself willingly. The armor cracked, light spilling through its seams, warm and bright against the darkness of the chamber. As the binding released, Alphonse's presence faded, not violently, but peacefully, like a breath finally exhaled. Edward turned too late. He called out, his voice breaking through the noise, but the space Alphonse had occupied stood empty now. The armor fell still, hollow at last, its purpose fulfilled. The world seemed to pause. Father faltered, momentarily disrupted by a variable he had not accounted for. An act given freely, without coercion or calculation. The ritual strained, its balance disturbed by something simple and unmeasurable. Edward knelt beside the fallen armor, his hand resting against it, steadying himself. There was grief there, deep and sharp, but beneath it lay something stronger. Understanding. Alphonse had trusted him, and that trust became the path forward. Edward rose again, eyes clear, resolve renewed. The battle continued, reshaped by a choice made not in desperation, but in love. The space before the gate felt vast and quiet, untouched by the chaos unfolding elsewhere. Edward stood alone. Before him rose truth, calm, familiar, neither welcoming nor cruel. The presence reflected him clearly, as though nothing could be hidden here. There was no rush in this place, no demand, only understanding, waiting patiently to be acknowledged. Edward did not plead. He spoke simply, with the clarity earned through loss. He understood now what he had chased for so long. Power had never been the answer. Knowledge alone could not mend what was broken. What mattered was the choice to protect what remained. When the exchange was made, it was done without anger. Edward offered the gate itself, his connection to alchemy, the ability that had defined him since childhood. In return, he asked for only one thing: Alphonse. Truth accepted. There was no flash of triumph, no sense of victory, just a quiet balance restored. The gate closed gently, and with it, the path Edward had walked his entire life came to an end. When Edward opened his eyes again, he was no longer alone. Alphonse lay beside him, breathing softly, human once more. His chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm, proof of a life returned. Edward remained still for a moment, simply listening, grounding himself in the sound. Around them, the struggle above had begun to settle. The overwhelming force that had threatened to reshape the world faded, its foundation undone. What remained was exhaustion and relief. Edward did not feel diminished. He felt complete. The long search was over. And though the path ahead would be different from the one he had imagined, it was finally one chosen freely, shaped not by power, but by purpose. Seasons passed quietly, as though the world itself needed time to settle. The brothers returned to Resembool without ceremony. The road felt shorter than before, not because distance had changed, but because the weight they carried had finally eased. Fields swayed gently in the wind. The sky stretched wide and familiar, unchanged by everything that had nearly been lost. Alphonse walked beside Edward, human once more. His steps were careful at first, each movement rediscovered with quiet wonder. Simple sensations, warmth, breath, balance, returned slowly, treasured rather than rushed. Edward watched him with a calm he had not known before, content to let the moment exist without needing to fix or prove anything. Life resumed in small, meaningful ways. Winry's workshop filled with sound again, tools clinking, laughter rising and falling naturally. Automail repairs were no longer about replacing loss, but about maintaining what remained. Edward adjusted to a life without alchemy, learning patience where instinct once ruled. He discovered that understanding the world did not require changing it. Alphonse studied with renewed curiosity, his questions grounded now in experience rather than longing. He carried his memories with care, aware of how easily things could be taken away, and how deeply they mattered because of it. Beyond Resembool, the country continued to heal. Scars remained, some visible, some hidden, but the shape of the future felt open again. Not perfect, not controlled, simply alive. As evening settled over the hills, the brothers stood outside their home, watching the light fade softly into night. There was no destination ahead demanding urgency, no power calling to be used. Only tomorrow. And for the first time, that was enough. The journey had ended, not in triumph, but in peace. Thank you for spending this quiet moment here. If this story helped you relax, unwind, or fall asleep, you're welcome to show your support by liking the video. If you have a favorite anime you'd love to hear retold in this calm, bedtime style, feel free to leave it in the comments. And if you'd like more peaceful anime stories like this one, you can subscribe to Sleepy Otaku Stories for future uploads. Rest well, and we'll continue the journey another night.